Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome back for part 2 of this episode with author and professor Jeff Meldrum and Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science.
Planet. I mean, it just,
Yeah.
it kind of, in the words of Renee DeHinden, it boggles the mind to contemplate. So that's my admonition.
This has really been great. I love it. So, okay, I do want to jump into your book now. So there's 16 chapters in this wonderful book, and a couple things here. The Science of Hidden Animals, Cryptozoology. Tell us a little bit about, just skim on that subject a little bit from your book.
Well, Bernard Heuvelmans is credited with being the father of cryptozoology. Crypto meaning hidden. So zoology is the study of animal life. So we're looking at the study of hidden animal life that species that were thought to have been extinct or are being encountered in unexpected places. So that's time, and also unexpected places. Oftentimes these are figures that may have been prominent in folklore and mythology, perhaps reflecting ancient encounters with these creatures by various cultures. And it has, it has been acknowledged as by many who are involved in the search for investigation for these cryptids, as they're sometimes referred to, species of cryptozoological interest, as a legitimate science, a subdiscipline of zoology. Many zoologists argue that point and say it's just, it's the discovery process of any zoological investigation or exploration, and that you really usually don't go out looking for unknown creatures, but unexpected creatures may be encountered. Now, that's not necessarily inaccurate. I mean, when I was talking about Russell Mittermeier and his jungle rats, one of those jungle rats, and now his name just escaped me because I wasn't thinking about it, but he would describe how he would go about discovering these new species of primate. He had discovered and described several new species of South American primate. Basically, he'll go into one of these remote villages, and the first thing he'll do is look around the village and to see if there are any little monkeys tethered to a stake somewhere, tied to a post, being kept as a pet. And then he'll look on the sides of the huts. Are there any unexpected looking skins of animals? And then he'll usually meet with the head man, and maybe if he can, he'll ask the head man, who's your best hunter? And then he'll sit down with the hunter, and he'll just have the hunter enumerate the different kinds of animals that he has seen in the forest. And when it gets to, possibly primates, he'll press a little more. Every once in a while, he'll mention or describe something that sounds a little unfamiliar. And by that process alone, he said in some of these remote areas, he discovered new species of primate. And so to say that real zoologists don't look for hidden animals, that's not a completely accurate or fair statement. Now, because of the sort of stigma that has been attached, because the popularized aspects of cryptozoology often focus on the sexy poster child species like the Loch Ness Monster and the Abominable Snowman and Bigfoot and Vocalium bembe and so forth. That tends to attract even further criticism. The good advocates, let's put it that way, the good advocates, people like Carl Schucker, do an excellent job of showing how the sort of the history of the discovery of quote hidden animals over the centuries, and how that discovery continues today. And it ranges from little tiny organisms to, I can remember one time they were describing this parasitic mite that lives on the mouth parts of this one tiny rare crustacean, this crab that is only found in a very short stretch of the coastline of Norway. Now, I mean, I find that fascinating. When you're talking about
Yeah.
the diversity, the biodiversity of this planet coming about through evolutionary adaptive radiation, whether or not you want to bring in the question of divine intervention versus, quote, intelligent design, where poof, 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 or a checklist is ticked off. Okay, this planet is going to have X through Z here, or X, Y, Z. What purpose in your plan, which presumably is focused on the salvation of humanity, is accomplished by placing little parasitic mites on the mouth parts of a rare crustacean that's only found in this 50-mile stretch of Norway's coastline? I mean,
Crazy.
when you think about it like that, I just find it amusing. But in any case, Dr. Bindernagel and I wrote a paper, mostly Dr. Bindernagel. He invited me to read it and then asked me, would you co-author it with me and add your perspective? But it was the objective was to examine the pros and cons of the subject, the investigation into the question of Bigfoot being subsumed within the greater umbrella of cryptozoology. And it raised some really interesting and important questions. And the overall conclusion was that it's been a disservice. By linking it to this more often perceived as tabloidish topic in the broadest sense, it has suppressed some interest in mainstream science. And it's an interesting exercise to consider the way in which all these topics have been received. But it's certainly of particular interest to us, interested in pursuing Bigfoot. I mean, I do not wear a cap as a cryptozoologist, even though I was a charter member of the of the International Cryptozoology Society. I might add, when it was organized, at the seminar held at the Smithsonian. But I am an anthropologist, anatomist, interested in relic hominoid species within our adaptive radiation of human ancestors and close relatives. And sure, I'm interested in, because of my fascination with natural history broadly, in the discovery of new species. I'm glad that we're still in the age of exploration and discovery, and we haven't settled into the false comfort zone of that everything's been done. Even if you wanted, whether that's described as a comfort zone, I would describe it as the disappointing that it's all been done, that there are no mountains left to climb, or no depths of the ocean left to explore. I mean, that's what science is about in my book.
Thank you. Chapter 6, caught on camera, photographic, and forensic measurements.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about forensic measurements and stuff like that, would you? I mean, and I know there's a term out there, dermatoglyphics or something.
Dermatoglyphics, which breaks down dermato, skin, and glyphics, etchings, engravings. So describing the etchings in the thick skin on the palms and soles of your feet. And if you're an Achilles, a spider monkey, on the pad, the friction skin on the prehensile tail, which has a distinctive tail print that's as unique as individual fingerprints to that particular individual.
Wow.
So it's an adaptation for grip, for holding on originally in arboreal settings, make sure you didn't slip off of the tree or the vine as you're climbing, and with the added advantage of broad, fleshy pads with supported by nails instead of recurved, compressed claws. So dermatoglyphics is an important. It kind of gets undue attention because of given its rarity. Dr. Krantz first published on the subject decades ago. It had actually been observed and mentioned by investigators in Idaho, in northern Idaho. There was a couple. There were a couple of faculty members who had a club, a cryptozoology club, and they actually went out and investigated some Bigfoot sightings, and one of those involved a resin cast. The individuals had not really understood the best way to make a plaster cast, and had tried to use a polyacrylic resin with a catalyst, and they poured in, and it picked up details, including skin ridge detail that these students noticed and mentioned.
Wow.
And I talk about this in my book to give acknowledgement to them, which preceded Grover's then published work, which was, you got to get things published, otherwise no one knows about it except for just along the grapevine. And
Right.
but if you look at the 300 plus casts in my drawers there's only a half a dozen to a dozen that show any discernible skin ridge detail, and none of it's extensive enough that you can look at two footprints from that same individual and find corresponding patches of the same dermatoglyphics. So its shelf life is very brief, and it depending on the nature of the substrate. And the substrate has to be very fine particulate matter, like a very fine dust. Like around here, we have this glacial loess, this fine talcum powdery soil, which when it's dry picks up, just like if you took some flour, sprinkled it on the counter and pressed your fingertips and then looked with the magnifying glass, you could see the skin ridge details. You could even probably see some of the little points of the sweat glands along the skin ridge detail, which Dr. Krantz was able to identify and notice in the detail of these casts. Or if the soil's wet, clayey, still fine enough particulate matter, then it will transfer. In either case, if it's extremely dry, it isn't consolidated, and the next, burst of dust from a passing vehicle or someone walking by, even the jolt of steps on the ground, it's like that scene in Independence Day where the vibration, I don't know how the vibration is working, because it's, unless the alien was actually in contact with this is one of those nitpicking things, but unless the spaceship was in direct contact with the moon, there would be no transfer of vibration. There's no atmosphere to conduct the vibration. But
That's a good point.
It rattles out the details. Well, that's what happens. And then if it's wet, gravity itself will pull those details out and flatten them out over time, especially if there's any more moisture in the atmosphere, or rain or mist. And we've done experiments to demonstrate this, and I've experienced it firsthand in the field in numerous occasions. But so there just aren't very many of these, and there have been some questions raised about the ability to make generalized statements across the species as a result of it. I mean, there's variation in human ridge breadth, and obviously in patterns. The distinctions between them and us are not as black and white as some people have assumed based on just off-the-cuff statements. Officer Jimmy Chilcutt remarked about the tendency for orientation of the ridges across the sole of the foot in the humans. They tend to run more transversely and to intersect with the side of the foot perpendicular to its edge, whereas with an ape, more commonly there's what's called a delta over here on the outer edge of the foot, from which ridges radiate. And so as they radiate, they tend to run parallel to the edge of the foot. Well, the problem is with that, it's not an either or, black and white, because the dominance of transverse ridges in the human foot only accounts for about 80%. The other 20% look very similar to the ape condition or variations thereon. And likewise within the 8 foot, even the expression of the pattern of arch or of ridges across the foot, and the appearance of deltas and so forth, those features are varied. And so you can't, it's A or it's B. You don't have just two bins. So it's interesting. I mean, the fact, and this is the important point, the fact that there are Bigfoot prints that do seem to exhibit dermatoglyphics is one more feature that links them to the order primates. Earth primates.
Right.
Again, not planet Pandora primates, or whatever, or sort of primate-like analogs. It's so that's about the only extent of it. There's a lot of confusion surrounding it. Otherwise, that comes up, whether they're faked or not. Attempts to fake them have been quite varied in their outcomes and show how unlikely it is. I mean, what is more likely to happen inadvertently, and I've seen this so many times, a novice witness sees a footprint there in the ground. What's the first thing they do? They touch it. They put their hand up beside it, or worse, they put their hand inside it. Or they're getting ready to take a picture or make a plaster cast, and the print in this moist soil has started to dry a little bit, and as a result, pieces crumble. And so rather than pour the plaster over the crumbled little dirt clods, what do? They stick their thumb in there and they push the dirt clods, either pick them out, or if the side's a little uneven now, as a result, they just tamp it with their finger. And what do? They transfer their skin ridge detail to the surface. There was one case where in a toe, Officer Chilcutt identified there was a little core. I don't remember if it was a loop or an arch or a whorl, but it was repeated 3 times down the length of the toe. And so he said, it's a hoax. Well, I said, well, wait a minute. Maybe not. The print may not be a hoax. I think that Freeman, and I kind of badgered and cajoled Freeman. I wanted him to let me take his fingerprints so that I could just compare where some of these spurious core patterns appeared, and just say, oh, well, look, it's his index finger. He just went bink, bink, bink down the length of the toe to dress it up a little bit before, he poured the plaster. But Paul wouldn't let me take his fingerprint. He didn't know me that well at that point, and he was a little insulted that I would ask. I mean, I can imagine why he didn't understand my motivation, which was not to condemning, accusing him of hoaxing, but rather just that he had succumbed to the very common mistake that folks make when, it's just almost a reflexive, irresistible impulse to point and stick your fingers in there. Don't touch. Stay back. Contaminate it.
Well, cool. Jeff, I'm going to wrap up a few things in one question as we get closer to the end here. First of all, the Patterson-Gimlin film and your reference and comparison to some bodybuilders.
Yeah.
Love that, especially the bodybuilders you use, Schwarzenegger, Yates. Those guys were great because I'm a fan of that sport. And then vocalizations, wood knocks, and then DNA testing for hair and things like that. So several things. Can you address a few of those things real quick?
The references to bodybuilders, people who are familiar with bodybuilding are also then very familiar with the muscular anatomy. And so by making those references, I can point out surface features that are visible on the Patterson-Gimlin film subject that are absolutely recognizable and correlate to muscular anatomy of a hominoid, a human-like primate. And whether it's, the trapezius, the erector spinae, the definition of the deltoid, even the heads of the triceps, the superficial heads of the triceps are visible. You can see the rectus femoris. You can see the biceps femoris and its tendon crossing behind the knee, as clear as day. You can see the heads of the gastro. Anyway, you can just go down with
Not a costume is what you're saying, right?
and
Yeah.
the second part then too is to demonstrate that Patty is enormous. When you go off of, say, Arnold's dimensions at the peak of his bodybuilding career, he still pales next to Patty. And so we had kind of fun trying to kind of comparing the dimensions derived from the film based on careful tracings and measurements, and using that foot, that 14 and a half to 15 inch. I think it's actually better to use 15 inches for that foot length as the scale. We can make a point for point comparison. I actually sent a copy of my book to the governor when he was in Sacramento.
Oh, really?
And got a very nice reply thanking me for this gift. He said, I'm very busy these days, and he said, I'll apologize ahead of time. I may not get to it right away, but I said, be appreciated. And I said, sure you look on page.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's one aspect of it. Recently, Bill Munns and I wrote a paper which appears, and this will be an opportunity to give a plug for the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. In addition to my book, a great source of information for your viewers is to be found in an online open access journal, an academic journal, scholarly journal that I edit. All the papers are peer reviewed, and research papers, in-depth book reviews, news items, commentary, etc., field reports, translations of historical documents in foreign language, and so forth. There's a paper within that. It's called the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. Very easy to search. And we're in our 13th year, so there's quite now an accumulation of submissions and contribution postings there. One of those is a paper that Bill Munns and I did, where we looked at those superficial features of the skin and adipose and visible underlying musculoskeletal landmarks, and drew correlation to human subjects as well as non-human primate subjects to show that this isn't a man in a fursuit. At best, it might be but it's not. As Janos Prohaska had suggested, the only way this could have been hoaxed is if you glued hair directly to the body surface of an actor, of a bodybuilder, and then
who's way bigger than Lou Ferrigno.
Where do you find someone just as you see it there? If that is just hair glued to the surface of a living being, where do you find someone with that dimensions? And this is where the other linear aspects come in. Dr. David Dager, a former classmate of mine at SUNY Stony Brook, and he's an anthropologist now. His specialty was from the neck up, looking at mascatory apparatus and chewing adaptations of the jaws and the teeth and so forth. But he took Grover to task based on Grover's statements that there wasn't a human alive that could fit the dimensions of Patty. And he turned to some anthropometric manuals that have all this combined data, like from military data, military recruits. They do tons and tons of measurements so they know how to make uniforms that will fit, and not to make too many of one size versus another, and so on. And how how a pilot will fit into a cockpit, all the ergonomic aspects of jet cockpit, tank, pilot seat, and so forth, so forth. Anyway, he misapplied some of those dimensions, some of the definitions of those dimensions and criticized Dr. Krantz. And I pointed out his error, that Krantz was absolutely right, and he wouldn't have it, and went on to replicate that error in other publications, including his book. But I stand by Krantz's statements that given the dimensions based on the feet, and not only the absolute dimensions, but the proportions, there is no human alive that could have been the entity upon which the hair was glued, or for that matter, have filled,
Right.
even if it was a form-fitting suit, a highly tailored suit. They didn't have stretch fabrics back then, so they didn't have, the spandex, the Spanx, or anything that would hug contours. It had to be tailored. It was non-stretch cloth, and that makes seams and irregularities and so forth. The skeptics try to point out some of these features as, quote, seams or margins, and that's where Bill and I pointed out they're absolutely consistent with humans, especially more aged humans that have more sagging, more dimpled, more cellulite features on their surface anatomy. Let's see, what else did you bring up?
There was the DNA with things like hair, and then also vocalizations,
Right.
wood knocks.
First, let me say from the outset, absolutely definitively, there is no known sample of Sasquatch DNA, period. So anything that you read, anything that you see out there where they make statements about evidence of hybridization or evidence of this or that, or comparing Sasquatch DNA to human DNA or to Neanderthal DNA, totally without footing, without basis. Because
Thank
there
you for
is no
sharing. Yeah.
confirmed Sasquatch DNA. Now, having said that, there have been efforts to get DNA from hair repeatedly. One of the characteristics that consistently, we think, when it comes to Sasquatch hair, to be honest, I have to also say, we have no confirmed hair attributed to Sasquatch, because the way to do that is either compare the unknown to a known standard in a collection somewhere, and that would require someone to walk up to a Sasquatch or to a pelt of a Sasquatch and pluck hairs and put them in the collection. But we can infer that these indeterminate hairs that have been collected have this remarkably consistent morphology, which is consistent with that of a primate, distinguished from those of human and other known primates. I mean, I have slides with chimp, gorilla, orang, baboon, macaque, hair, the colobus monkey, that I can put under the microscope beside an alleged Sasquatch hair. Sasquatch hair is parallel-sided, grows to length, has a blunt-tipped wear, has distinctive morphology of the pigment granules and distribution, lacks a cellular medulla, the dark band that appears under the microscope on the hair. And therein is the kicker, because that medulla typically contains remnants of cells, their nuclei and mitochondria, that yield DNA when a hair strand is examined, especially that doesn't have an actively growing follicle or a skin tag attached from forceful extraction from the follicle. Has an attached a hair bulb, an actively growing bulb, I should say. In any case, on rare occasions, DNA has been gotten, and invariably it tests as human. Now, usually those tests are very limited in the amount of sequence that they generate. But with that result, the conclusion is either drawn as that it's contamination through mishandling by the investigators or whoever, or that it's simply a human hair that has been misattributed to a human. hair persists in the environment, and it's rather durable, and so there's no guarantee that when you find a strand of hair on a branch or on a fence, coincident with a supposed visual encounter, that is a hair that was shed by what you think you saw, even if it was,
Right.
And so, but when we have hair after hair after hair that is primate hair that seems to defy attribution to any common form of wildlife and differs from humans in some distinctive ways, at least generally, and yet is remarkably inherently consistent, whether it's collected in Alaska or southeastern Texas, that's pretty telling. And so I'm confident we have a quote, as Dr. Henry Fehrenbach referred to it originally, as the gold standard, although he apparently is reportedly has retracted some of his support of that notion of having determined a gold standard. I say, well, show me the evidence. I mean, what's caused you to rethink that position? You've got to show me some evidence. You can't just say, well, I'm not so sure anymore, because I'm pretty sure based on what you've said in the past and what I've seen under the microscope, and I have continued where he has left off, looking at more and more samples. Yeah. Now, there is an outfit, there is an enterprise undertaken to try to do the definitive examination of hair. And Dr. Darby Orcutt from North Carolina, University of North Carolina, is leading that charge. And I'm still in the process of kind of getting acquainted with the people he's recruited and vetting them. I mean, we've been burned twice, big time, by two big name, not so big name, one big name investigators who have done us wrong. And I don't want to be the victim of that again. So I want to vet these people rather thoroughly. But he's to be commended for having recruited an active research lab or two to participate in this analysis. I mean, the fundamental question is, here are these indeterminate hairs. Something is shedding them. We should be able to determine. And if we can't definitively do it with morphology, then the next step is by DNA. But unfortunately, we don't have a known standard of Sasquatch DNA either. So all we can do is take that novel strand and look at it in comparison to the known sequence for human, Neanderthal, for non-human grade 8 representatives, and see, where does it fall? Does it nest, over here beside Neanderthals and humans, or does it fall closest to an orangutan, a more distantly related grade ape, or is it more similar to the African apes, which might suggest an earlier Australopithecine offshoot? I mean, we can make some interesting informed inferences by trying to fit it within the known family tree, but until we actually have a specimen from which we can derive tissues and extract DNA, it'll still be inferential. Yeah.
Crazy.
It's exciting. That's got to be
amazing.
Short of a physical specimen, or a definitive piece of one, a novel DNA sequence will be a huge step forward. Now, I would add there's no precedent for recognizing the existence of a novel species on the basis of sequence alone. We've used sequences to, say, differentiate between subspecies in museum drawers, skins and skulls in museum drawers. But this will be a test case of whether this is going to be sufficiently acceptable evidence for acknowledging the existence of a novel species, to have, that replicable novel sequence that cannot be attributed to any known species out there. It'll be exciting development.
Yeah. Well, as we tail towards the end here, anything significant to say about vocalizations or wood knocking and stuff like that?
Well, again, we have this. We're laboring, as with so much of the evidence, we're laboring ultimately under the disjunct we don't really have any documented cases of audio visual recordings where the vocalization is seen being generated by the actual entity in question.
Yeah.
So we have all these different vocalizations that are attributed. It's kind of like with the hair a little bit. I mean, a good recording and a good sonogram is almost as substantial as a strand of hair. And so we have these vocalizations that can't readily be attributed to any common forms of wildlife. They seem to be animate, spontaneous and animate, not machine generated, digitally generated, that is. Um, but we don't know for sure. Now, as is to be expected, the repertoire, the variety of vocalizations that have been attributed to Bigfoot are varied, and that is consistent with the varied vocalizations of other great apes. Also consistent with great apes that have territories that they tend to defend, whether it's defending a harem like with gorillas or defending the actual real estate like with orangs. They use loud calls to advertise their presence, whether to ward off intruders, interlopers, challengers, or maybe they're the challenger and they're using their loud call to advertise their challenge to the resident male. In the case of orangs, those calls also advertise to potential mates that they're here. The lights on. Stop by and see that. I say that facetiously, but with orangs, those hookups are pretty rare. I mean, spanning years. The interbirth interval, yeah, for
Really?
orangs is 6 to 7 years. Their infants grow slowly and develop and are dependent on mom for a long time. So she's not interested in adding to her little family. She's a single mom essentially,
Makes sense.
and so his vocalizations, not only does he keep away the interlopers, although it's interesting. I just came upon this recently. They actually did some DNA studies, since we were talking about DNA, of some of these communities of orangs, and they found that the offspring, the next generation, it was like only 65% of them were fathered by the dominant alpha male. The others were fathered
Oh.
by the interloping bachelors, right, who sneak in under cover of the canopy and link up with the females. The females kind of
Wow.
light some new blood once in a while, I guess. But see, we can
Love that.
transpose this. What are the calls that we hear associated with Bigfoot, which is probably a solitary, has a social structure not unlike that of a orangutan. The males, boom, have these loud, banshee screaming loud calls or roars, and are probably responded to by females in this case that are they're spacing themselves so that they don't overlap each other in resource utilization. The males are advertising their dominance to any young bucks coming up the ranks, and they're also advertising their availability should the ladies want a night out on some occasion, that they're here I am, come see me. And
Ah.
so we do have those kind of calls. We then also have this whole variety of whoops and gibberish, the samurai chatter, and of course that term brings in the Sierra sounds, which are one of the most publicized uh, sets of vocalizations that still, while they're intriguing, and people like Scott Nelson, the cryptolinguist, has drawn all kinds of interesting inferences about them. There still hangs uh, some uncertainty, lack of conclusiveness, because I mean, for me, the litmus test is the footprints, and unfortunately, the footprints associated with this whole story are not convincing at all. and quite problematic. Some of them. Now, and I haven't
Yeah.
seen good documentation of all of them. I've seen a few photos that are more akin to what we think. Again, a model of the Sasquatch foot has emerged from this examination of literally hundreds of casts, and as well as in addition to footprint or photographs of footprints and so forth, scans. But some of them, they're these funny fin-shaped outlined with sausage toes, as has sometimes been described, that are perfectly uniform across the distal end. You can't tell if you're looking at a right or a left foot, and that's really problematic. So I don't know. I mean, it's I'm still
There's
I'm
more to
still
be known, right?
enthusiastic and think that they should continue to be looked at and considered. They and as years go by, and as Ron has spoken more openly about some of the other things that have supposedly happened, the high strangeness, which I have a tendency to keep apart, but bouncing balls of light, orbs, and so forth, and things that, to my knowledge, have not been documented well. So it's subjective, personal experiences, anecdotes of experiences, and I'm always concerned that you need to have documentation. People cannot be, and as much as I trust or have developed friendship, people, even me, it cannot be taken purely at their word. They need to put up, or I would
Right.
say, shut
Right.
up, because this muddies the water. Uh,
Right.
having had, I mean, this goes, the full spectrum, because I'm most focused on the footprints. There's something relatively tangible. I mean, it's not a foot, if we want to say not a tangible body, but it's that trace evidence is tangible in that we can measure it, we can observe it, we can document it and replicate it. Okay. Based on that, when people claim to have seen footprints, some never document them. Okay, then those go in one bin. Some do document them, but when you look at them, they're so unintelligible that they have to go into another bin. And then others are clearly misidentified human footprints or bear tracks or sometimes even other things. And so those go into another bin. And then there's this one bin that only has a very slow accumulation of good examples of probable real footprints attributable to Sasquatch. Given that paucity of reliable, documented cases of footprints reported, how do you think the visual encounters would fare? And so, oh man, there's a lot of chaff, a lot of fluff, and it's just one of the problems with the popularization of the subject matter is, anybody can give a reasonable description of an experience and a visual encounter, even fabricating footprints, but making them and that's why having the acumen, having the knowledge of the underlying anatomy and functional morphology is critical in evaluating these, and the tracking experience. Just the other day, for example, I got a second party, an intermediary, sent me pictures that had been taken by an acquaintance of his, and they were these odd four-toed prints. And of course, he got into a discussion right off the bat in his question about four-toed and three-toed prints, and yada yada yada. Well, it was in snow, very wet snow. The boot prints of supposedly it was the landowner were quite visible. But then there were two instances, two slightly different was all. In between boot prints, there was what he was describing as this four-toed footprint. Well, they weren't imprints at all. They were gouged out snow. And I asked him, how many fingers do you have on your hand? Ignoring your thumb for a minute. 4. Isn't that interesting? 4 fingers scooped up to
Right.
make a snowball there from the snow in between your boots. And then the second one was the same. 4 toes, the toes a little, but the toes were dragged. I mean, the quote toes, the appendages were dragged and then deeper gouged out the snow down to the dirt. And I said, and the guy says, oh no, this guy's adamant. He said, he's the only one. It's just his boot prints. I says, well, then that just tells me that he's the one that made the snowball. I says, if there was
Right.
something or other walking around in that wet snow, don't you think there'd be more than 2 footprints without appealing to
Right.
an extraordinary explanation? But see, the simpler explanation isn't necessarily more likely to be true, but you have to falsify it first. You got to convince me that isn't somebody's 4 fingers and a scoop of snow to make a snowball. So,
Right.
and that the most likely way to do that would be to demonstrate that there are more than just these couple right there. So
well, Jeff, we're getting here. I've had you a long time, but I'm going to do a couple things here because I could keep going. But here's the thing: what is this? It's real. Wasatch is real, or Sasquatch is real. In your mind, what are we looking at?
Well, that's where I use the term relic hominoid. A hominoid, when it was that term, relic hominoid, was coined by Boris Porshnev, an anthropologist, a Russian anthropologist. He meant the term hominoid just as in a generic sense, a man-like creature, to describe these various species of upright, man-like monsters. And that term's been used in various book titles and movie screens and so forth. Man-like monsters. Relic means a remnant population that was once perhaps more widespread, or was common at an earlier time that has persisted into the present, maybe in a much rarer set of circumstances. Relic hominoid. Hominoid also, though, has a precise taxonomic meaning, and it refers to a member of the superfamily Hominoidea. It's so named because it includes the man-like apes, the tailless apes. So from gibbons on up to gorillas and chimps and orangs. So now, having prefaced that, in anthropology, we know now that the evolutionary history of humanity isn't this single file march of one species giving rise to another, but rather a bushy tree. There were multiple ways to be an upright, bipedal walking, bigger, increasing size brained, tool using hominin. And even amongst the apes, the great apes today are themselves relics. They're populations that are largely on the verge of extinction, especially when you look at the orangs and the mountain gorilla. The orangs once had a much wider range. There were species on the mainland and so forth. They are themselves relics from an age when there were literally hundreds. We now have fossils of hundreds of different species of great ape that lived through the Miocene into the mid-Pleistocene.
Wow.
So in that bushy tree, we have also recognized that some of those branches have persisted until more recently than would have ever been thought possible. So, over amongst the apes, we have Gigantopithecus at least recognized to have persisted up to the mid to late Pleistocene, maybe as recently as 200,000 years ago in the known fossil record. We have other species of hominins, like we have the hobbit, which is Homo floresiensis, which is almost certainly a relic Australopithecine, that it persisted up until about 50,000 years ago. We have Homo erectus in Southeast Asia, some of which have been dated in the past to as young as 25,000 years ago. We have Homo heidelbergensis. Now there's been a lot of brouhaha about the dragon man and some of these other possible Denisovan-related ones, but that they're up to about 200,000 years ago, like Gigantopithecus. But we've got specimens of Homo heidelbergensis in China as recently as 10 to 20,000 years ago. We have specimens of Neanderthals in the Ural Mountains of Europe that could be as young as 10,000 years. So the point is, what is Bigfoot? What is the Yeti? What is the orang pendek? What is the Hobbit? What is the Yowie? The Yowie is a whole different question. We'll wait on that one. But these are simply relic branches of this bushy tree. Sasquatch has a distribution that was formerly, presently still, but I think originally the population gave rise in Asia. Its distribution stretches from the Caucasus Mountains all the way up and over the Bering Strait into North America. And it's just I think it's a representative of the Pleistocene megafauna. It's the primate representative of these large northern latitude species that have persisted into the present, and there's more to be discovered.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Crazy. Well, look, I've loved this. This has been great. Before we wrap up, Red River Gorge Bigfoot Fest.
Well,
these
events, these whether it's a conference or a festival or any number of different terms, retreat, have popped up like mushrooms all across the country. It's a really interesting phenomenon. And as an academic, for me, it provides a great platform for academic outreach. I mean, it gives an opportunity for another voice, in addition to those things that they see on cable television. And even my appearances, sometimes it's frustrating. I'll spend an entire day with the film crew in my lab and hours and hours and hours of interview, and I have 45 seconds of opining on a documentary. So this one is just another one of those that was organized by Lee Kirkland, and he's got a great lineup of speakers. They're fun because they provide the attendees quite a diversity of points of view, and that's great. I mean, I sometimes am a little chagrined by the company that I'm asked to keep, to put it that way. At least the company's always pleasant. I don't mean to say it like that, but the topics, because it's often sometimes they're quite a potpourri of points of view, as opposed other times there tend to be more focused with speakers that are more similar mind to the subject matter as I am. People like Cliff Barrickman and the Olympic Project investigators, and David Ellis with his analysis of vocalizations and so forth. But oftentimes too, they're punctuated with all kinds of fun activities and other appearances of other luminaries, and there are vendors tables. So it's an opportunity for people to get a book and get a signature if you're so inclined to collect authors' autographs and other fun stuff. I always exhibit and sell replica casts that have historic or significant anatomical interest, and gives enthusiasts and investigators alike an opportunity to both study and have a piece of this sort of historic investigation.
Right.
So they're fun. They're great. I make no apologies for participating. Sometimes people, get after me, but it's a great opportunity to educate. I mean, I'm a huge advocate for citizen science, applying the rigors of critical thinking and objectivity to investigations, and the principle of parsimony. And so it's an opportunity for me to share some of those perspectives, some of those principles, and to field questions like we've done today about topics that are of interest to people who go after this topic.
Yeah. And that is this year, May 30th and 31st, 2025. And what?
That's in
Where
Kentucky.
where is that
in
again?
Kentucky. And you can find,
Kentucky. Okay.
if you go to my Facebook page, I kind of use my Facebook page just as a bulletin board. And I put announcements of these things that I will be speaking at. And I'll try to make a point today to post my itinerary, essentially my schedule for 2025. I'm slated to speak at about 15
Wonderful.
different events scattered across the continent. So it'll be a busy and fun year.
Well, there you go. That's great. Thank you for saying that, because I was going to ask
Right.
you how people can follow what you're doing this year. Lastly, is there any new projects, books, or anything like that
Yes,
coming
in fact,
in the future?
Doug Hychek, who produced Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, the documentary that my book was essentially started off as a companion volume 2, but kind of grew beyond the confines of a 50-minute documentary to include lots more information. He's well on his way through filming a sequel to that, a follow-up, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 2, where he will explore
Nice.
along those same lines of evidence and present what has been discovered, revealed, or new questions along those lines of evidence, some of which we've talked about and broken down in the chapter. So I'm writing a sequel to that as well. It got kind of set back. I'm running
Nice.
behind schedule because of the medical emergency I experienced a year plus ago that nearly punched my ticket. But
Oh, no.
so I had to convalesce from that for a half a year, and the next year, 2024, was kind of in low gear. But I'm ready to shift up now. Things are going a lot better, and so my top of my to-do list is to complete that project. I have several other writing projects. I'm constantly editing the Relic Hominoid inquiry. I'm trying to direct assistance and towards Darby Orcutt's DNA project to make sure, if in fact that's merits it, that it gets the support it needs, and so on. So I'm staying busy. Not as ambitious in my outdoor excursions because of the consequences of this whole thing, but still, trying to facilitate and trying to be there as a voice of reason in the face of a proliferation of
Yes.
sometimes less than
Everything.
reasonable adventures, but we'll see how that turns out.
So will this number 2 book be out in 2025 or
Well,
2026?
if I can pull a rabbit out of my hat, maybe by the end of 2025. But unfortunately, I don't think it will accompany
Okay.
the release of the documentary. It will follow on its heels, and that plus,
Yeah.
it gives me some time too to make sure that it's quite inclusive of what ends up in the documentary along the way. So, yeah,
Yes.
looking forward to it.
Very good. Can't wait for that to come out. Well, Jeff, let me keep you for a minute after I tail this up just real quick. So I want to thank you so much for being on the show. You've been gracious with your time. We've went over quite a bit. And thank you for being willing to share such good information with the group. And thank you. And so for everyone out there, the next time you are camping, hiking, or hunting, will you keep an eye up there looking for the Bigfoot? Maybe you should. But in the meantime, remember, there's a lot of strange and unexpected in our reality. So keep your eyes, ears, and minds open. And until next time, stay safe.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.